It's just wildly different. The LV2 still has I'm holding the paintball gun feel.
Am I totally insane and not put the battery back in this gun?
This is the 05 Ego, Planet Eclipse's first paintball gun, and now 9 generations later, we have the LV2. And I think obviously just looking at the thing, just how far the Ego's come. There's no more hose, there's no AT pipe. The gun just looks much more modern, but there's some stuff on the inside of there that just kind of feels old. The LV2, just like the LV1, is a stack tube design. So 2 tubes, that lower tube is gonna have the lever valve, the top tube is gonna have the bolt, so it's still basically the same design, but out of the box, the LV2 sure does shoot different.
You know, one of the things I really like about the way these LV2 shoot is just kind of how more crisp it is when it shoots. The original LVs kind of had a, I don't know, we'll say like an airy, it was kind of a slower shot. It's very like slow.
You know who isn't slow? BFPgear.com, the sponsor of this video. They have all types of shipping. You can get free shipping on a lens if you order one, or upgrade it to free overnight. Honestly, I probably wouldn't overnight a lens, but it's an option if you want to. BFP Gear have helped me out in this channel for years. They helped me get this LV2 for review, so make sure and show them some support next time you need a lens, or maybe you're gonna pick up one of these LV2s. I mean, they're one of the bigger dealers in the world, so they always have the freshest stock. BFPgear.com. Thank you guys. So I was in the field trying to explain that to someone the other day, and they had like no idea what I'm talking about. But the LV1 kind of had a slower, kind of softer shot. This is because of the lever valve that Planet Eclipse introduced in the LV1. That lever valve requires less energy to open. It opens longer, giving it a softer shot over guns with a more traditional valve, like the ones Planet Eclipse used in the 05 Ego all the way through that Ego 11. You know, but the LV2 also has that lever valve, but really the LV2 does shoot quite a bit different.
I'm gonna go straight to that thing.
You know, I used Intimidators and Angels for quite a long time. Those guns definitely have a kind of firm, crisp shot. And I really liked that. That's kind of why I didn't like the LV1, but this LV2 certainly has a more firm, kind of satisfying, crisp, more feedback shot when compared to the LV1. Thinking about the Intimidators and the Angels, the LV2 really reminds me of the way my G6R shot, or even my Angel A1 Fly. I mean, that gun shot really well. It was very weird though. Shot good though. And I'm gonna upload more of this gameplay footage, so if you wanna make sure you don't miss it, make sure you subscribe. I mean, just listen to this 05 versus the LV2. It's just wildly different, but the 05 do shoot well though. Yeah, it shoots good. There's probably one main reason the gun shoots a little bit different. It still has that same lever valve. You know, the rammer's still in the same place. You still have the basic same bolt design, but they've kind of rearranged the front quite a bit. So now that low pressure regulator is located in the foregrip, and then moving that LPR into the foregrip just adds quite a bit more volume or space inside the front of the gun. So now this operates at 115 PSI versus the 135 that like the LV1 or say the LV1.6 operates at. And I think it makes it shoot a little bit different. I don't think you're gonna see like, you know, the gun's not gonna be like easier on paint dramatically. It's not like way quieter or anything, but it definitely changes the way the gun feels and changes the way it shoots a little bit. One of the best parts about the LV2 is you can make it shoot however you want. So these come with 2 different weight rammers. You can put the lightweight rammer in there, it's gonna be a little bit more air efficient, or you can slide the heavy one in there, it's gonna use a little bit more air, but the gun shoots a little smoother. And you can also adjust the forward and backward speed of that rammer by adjusting the flow rate on the side of the solenoid, just like the LV1. And thankfully, this LV2 solenoid is rebuildable, unlike that LV1 solenoid. LV1 solenoid is like $200, so it's just cool that you can buy a few parts and now rebuild the LV2 solenoid. And finally, you can adjust the low pressure and high pressure regulators. And both of those are going to be found on the bottom of the foregrip, that low pressure one being blue and high pressure being red. The cool thing is you can only adjust that high pressure regulator if the foregrip is covered. So if you got the rubber foregrip on, you can't adjust the low pressure regulator, which is, is a good thing. If you don't like the way it shoots out of the box, you could probably make it shoot a little bit more like that LV1.
I'm gonna go there. Not, well, further than that, probably right there.
But I personally like to leave these guns stock. I think the manufacturers kind of find the perfect operating pressure. They kind of find the perfect settings to make the guns work the best in most conditions and just make them the most reliable.
Man, I don't know where anyone's at really.
So I'm stock settings guy, but the LV2, just like the LV1, super adjustable. And one of the weirder parts about the LV1 was that air transfer pipe. It's just kind of an odd way to move air around. I mean, great, you don't have a macro line, but you still got this weird tube pipe thing on the outside of the gun. And thankfully, the LV2 has completely gotten rid of that AT pipe. And similarly to the CS1, the air goes completely through the trigger frame. You know, the first time I picked up one of these guns, I noticed this Allen key spot and was confused. I was like, they moved that SFR to the trigger guard. I mean, it definitely looks like that, right? But then, 10 seconds later, it was just like, oh no, they just plugged up that air passageway. On the CS1, that air passageway is not plugged. It's just drilled from both sides and then they meet at the intersection. I just assumed that making them meet like that is much more difficult than just drilling straight through and plugging it. Getting good smooth airflow is extremely important to really all factors of the paintball gun. You don't want air going through some crazy weird angles or turning 90 degrees. So it's possible that having that plug in there makes it a little bit smoother transition in airflow compared to that CS1. Maybe if that's an improvement though, it's probably, very, very, very small. Getting rid of that AT pipe definitely affects the ergonomics a bit, but the biggest thing to affect the way the gun feels is just relocating that LPR into the foregrip. So now that foregrip is quite a bit larger than the LV1. It's really kind of square, blocky foregrip, comparatively to like say the CS2 or the Go4 that have a much more rounder feel. This has a real square feeling. I don't think it's as square as say the original Vanquish, but it's definitely square when compared to like the other Planet Eclipse guns. But because of that stacked tube kind of taller design, there's definitely just kind of more grip on the front of the gun. So personally, I'm able to just get a really good grip on the LV2, is where I hold guns like the CS2 or 170R and my hand just kind of feels like it's going to slip out the bottom. So I can get a really good grip on these tall fronted guns like the LV2 or the previous LV1. And that same square feel goes to the trigger frame as well. But it's streamlined. It kind of reminds me like of a bulkier, like Field 1 forced frame maybe. I mean, it's definitely bigger than a lot of the other guns out there. It's bigger than the CS2 frame, it's bigger than the Go4, TM40, definitely the force frame. The main reason it's big is because they crammed a 9-volt battery in there, whereas a lot of the other guns like that Go4 have a regulator in the frame, and having the regulator is just more cylindrical and smaller, so you can just make that trigger frame quite a bit smaller. Whereas the LV2, you got that big blocky squarish battery you got to stick in there, which kind of gives the frame that big blocky square shape. So these are a big gun. It still kind of has that really big feel that the LV1 had. So if you liked that big kind of like bulky, like I'm holding a paintball gun feel, the LV2 still has that I'm holding a paintball gun feel. The rear of the trigger frame has a whole new navigation console. So those buttons feel really nice when you press them. They're just really easy to push. That new OLED screen is very bright and very crisp. It's really easy and crisp inside. When you take it outside though, it's kind of hard to see. All these OLED screens are just difficult to see, it's like looking at your phone in direct sunlight. It's just kind of hard to look at. Whereas these LCD screens that we had on the previous Planet Eclipse guns were much better in direct sunlight. I liked the LCD. I'd kind of wish they'd stuck with the LCD over the OLED. Getting the grips off, I've noticed, is way easier too. Maybe not right here, this is...
Oh, am I totally insane and not put the battery back in this gun? Oh, I'm going too fast. It's hard with that tank on. There we go.
The grip style's still relatively the same, right? You get the little latches on the side, but I feel like they come off really easy. Getting them on the CS2 or like Go4 isn't like difficult, but sometimes they get a little tweaked and they kind of I'll finagle them a little bit. I don't know, I feel like the LV2 grips just kind of like go on a little bit easier. And you look at the inside of the LV2 and there are 3 boards and a separate micro switch. And we say we look at the CS2, it does have 2 boards in that trigger frame. You have the top eye board, and then you have the main board, but it's just all much more contained, right? You can't see like wires and you really can't see what's going on. So I just feel that the CS2 trigger frame just feels a lot more modern and new. whereas we have wires and stuff going all on side of the LV2. Planet Clips have done a good job though keeping all of those wires on one side of the gun. I mean, there's good slots and like cuts into the frame that help kind of guide the wires into place. The wires are perfect length. So if you're really careful, you're not going to really pinch any of those wires, but that's kind of always been the case, right? If you were always careful, you always kind of weren't going to pinch any wires. But if you go quick and you try to put that frame on quickly, it's really possible to pinch or crimp some of those wires. And there's also still a hose on the bottom of the gun, just like that LV1. And this thing for sure, if you just put the frame on, there's no question, you're gonna smash that hose and the gun's just not gonna work. So you have to kind of push it out of the way with an Allen wrench when you're putting the frame on. It's wonky and just seems old, right? I mean, if you have a CS2, you got a G04, you have a 170R, or even the Etha 3, Planet Eclipse's cheapest electric gun, you don't really have to worry about these wires or the tubes or hoses inside of the gun. Just look at the inside of this 05 Ego compared to that LV2, right? It's really not all that much different. There's all those wires and just stuff going on, and you'd assume with so many versions later that the inside would just look a little bit nicer. And the CS2 doesn't have wired eyes like the LV2. The CS2 uses the light pipe system. It's a dedicated board that sits on top of the trigger frame. That beam from the eyes is fed through a prism in the breech. And the LV2 uses those old school wired eyes, you know, that probably honestly work perfectly fine. There's probably no real advantage to that like prism light pipe eye system. But it's just old, and I really wish on the most expensive Planet Eclipse gun ever, they'd kind of ship it with the highest end features and specs they've ever made.
Hey, 50's on me for sure. Oh, I put that right in your chest. Kill from the 50, center 50.
The LV2 is coming with Planet Eclipse's newest trigger. It's the same trigger system we're finding on the 170R and the G04. It's kind of neat. You can just change the face of the trigger, so it just makes it kind of cheaper if you want to, you know, get different trigger styles. I think I preferred the LV1 trigger though. It's a little bit heavier and maybe provides a little bit more feedback. But both of those triggers, the LV1 and the LV2 trigger, are not as advanced as the CS2 trigger. The CS2 trigger is just more adjustable. You can adjust all the same things as you can on the LV1 and LV2, but the CS2 trigger, you can adjust the rake. It's kind of cool, but I don't know, I didn't really like this CS2 trigger. It was really complicated. It seemed like it was just awkward to set up. Most people probably weren't using the rake. So while I think the CS2 trigger is probably more advanced, I don't know if it's necessarily better than the LV2 trigger. The LV2 trigger is definitely easier to adjust, and like I said, most people probably weren't adjusting the rake. Trigger feel is definitely a preference thing, and it was one of the things that was better about the older Planet Eclipse guns is they were giving you the option of using that optical sensor or the micro switch. The optical sensor is a light sensor, so as soon as the trigger passes through, it gets a little darker and then it knows the gun should fire. There's also the micro switch, which we're all kind of familiar with. It's that mouse click. Most people liked that mouse click, the micro switch, because it provides a little bit more feedback though, but I kind of liked how we had both of the options, the optical and the micro switch. And now on all the newer guns, it's just all micro switch. I don't like it. There's also a new barrel, the S63 Barrel. It's a, we'll say, 3-piece barrel. It's going to take these inserts. There's a barrel back and a barrel tip. You know, the barrel tip and barrel back screw together, and the insert can only enter through the back. The insert kind of make up the shank or the rear of the barrel threaded portion that go inside the gun. It's a barrel, it shoots well. You know, it shot just as well as the previous Planet Eclipse barrels. Shoots good. There's threads on the inside of here, which is kind of cool. Eventually they're gonna make a rifled one. That's cool. It's a barrel. All the Planet Eclipse guns have this, but they do this like offset feed neck thing. It just kind of helps paint feed a little bit easier. You technically break a little less paint. But I think that this is probably the most noticeable I've ever seen it. You can even see like the milling's kind of more aggressive on one side than another. It's just really aggressive. Right behind that feed neck is probably the coolest part of the gun. Those two little marks that line up with the bolt so you can insert the bolt perfectly every time. It's kind of what everyone wanted, right? I mean, the LV2 is kind of just an LV1 that's just more modern. but I feel like it could be even more modern, right? I mean, when we're looking at the CS2 that's like 4 or 5 years old at this point, there are some things that feel nicer on it, right? That trigger, that light pipe eye system, you don't have the wired eyes, and then the boards and everything is just kind of more contained, and it just feels a little bit more modern and a little bit more nicer. So I don't know, I feel like the LV2 is fantastic. It's a wonderful paintball gun, it's great, but in this price range, you know, anything over $1,500 is a lot. I mean, $1,500. Anything over like $700 or $500 at this point is a lot of money for a paintball gun. I mean, you can go get the Ether 3 and it's awesome. So I don't know. I mean, it's getting more and more difficult to say if these high-end guns are good. Or they're definitely good, but it's definitely getting more and more difficult to say if they're worth spending the money on. I don't know, that's just how I'm ending this. LV2 is a really good paintball gun, but it's really expensive.